Acclaim returns to remind us why no one trusted licensed games. You can tell the NES had reached peak pop culture market saturation in 1989 because you had games like Knight Rider, where Acclaim and Pack-In Video teamed up and said inexplicably, what if we made a video game about a TV show that hasn't been on the air for 3 years?
That still made it a lot more timely and relevant than a lot of other licensed games we've seen on NES Works 1989, though. Knight Rider probably wouldn't have meant a lot to the NES preteen set, but any NES fan old enough to have memories of watching TV in 1983 would have been intrigued by the prospect of a game where you can, as the box says, drive the car from the hit TV series. Despite the property's full obsolescence at this point, Knight Rider still seems like a pretty solid selection for an NES game. Certainly it makes more sense than Acclaim's other TV-based release that year, Airwolf. Both shows were cut from the same cloth, but Knight Rider was the more accessible of the pair. It was about a cool and extremely tanned guy in a leather jacket who drove a nigh indestructible Trans Am that could talk, which is a hell of a lot more interesting to a 7-year-old than all the political and military ruminations of Airwolf. Honestly, this show seems tailor-made to kickstart the endorphins of young boys. Like a lot of 80s primetime action shows like The A-Team and The Dukes of Hazzard, Knight Rider was low on intellectual heft and high on easily accessible escapism. Created by Glenn A. Larson, which explains the Cylon-like eye of hero car Kit, Knight Rider followed in the grand tradition of American media revolving around an iconic car. You don't really see a lot of that sort of thing today, presumably because present-day automobiles have depressingly little personality, but I feel like these shows were a mainstay of the latter 20th century mediascape. From Herbie the Love Bug to Starsky and Hutch's Red Gran Torino, to the Duke Boys' racist Dodge Charger, to a certain DeLorean. The cool automobile was a crucial element of the American mediascape, a reflection of the broader culture. This actually ties back in with Who Framed Roger Rabbit.
That won't be Cloverleaf Industries by any chance, huh?
And it's also why almost every American born before 1972 has become massively deranged from lead poisoning. But hey, maybe it was all worth it to get a Cylon sports car. Certainly the Knight Rider concept strikes me as more realistically aspirational than ever owning my own personal Airwolf. Sadly, I'm no Ray Smuckles. Speaking of which, certainly Knight Rider is the better of the two games. It's more simplistic by far, but more complicated does not always mean better when it comes to video games. Pack-In Video kept things reasonable for once. Knight Rider takes a far more direct approach to its design than something like Rambo, playing out as a fairly straightforward road combat game. I will say that the developer uncharacteristically fumbled a bit here in terms of maintaining the license's integrity. For all their quirks and flaws, Pack-In Video games tended to be pretty good about trying to translate a film or TV show to NES without violating its underlying spirit. But there's a lot more shooting and missile launching in Knight Rider for NES than ever existed in the show. Kit, the souped-up Trans Am, who was such an iconic element of the series, had a lot of unusual powers, but they tended to be about protection and defense. Things like composite armor, turbo acceleration, and disguises. After all, the hero's name is Michael Knight, a cop-turned-freelancer who, like a true knight of chivalry, avoids falling afoul of vigilante tropes by making his mission about protecting the innocent, not punishing the guilty. So it does seem to be a little bit like missing the point that the game's core mission mode involves blowing up bad guys with lasers and missiles. Michael Knight would never. Then again, maybe that was a mandate from the publisher, Acclaim, who surely understood that American kids would be a lot more excited about a driving game with explosions than they would a pure driving game. And so I choose to read Knight Rider's alternate drive mode as Pack-In Video asserting its collective respect for the source material. Drive mode turns Knight Rider into the NES's answer to Victory Run, stripping away weapons-based combat in favor of a pure, destination-focused race against time where opposing cars attempt to ram you, but you don't and can't shoot anyone. It's a pretty good racing game, considering the constraints of the hardware, but it's certainly not the main event. No, the main event is Mission Mode, in which Michael Knight and his amazing talking Trans Am Kit tear across the American landscape, driving from city to city in a race to prevent Michael and Kit's evil counterparts, Garth Knight and Goliath, from enacting some manner of evil scheme. This mission takes you from Los Angeles to New York and back again on a 16-phase trip where you can always see your destination in the distance, as iconic landmarks like the Space Needle and Empire State Building flit along the horizon. If I were the sad sort of person who could only comprehend video games in terms of other games, I would say that Knight Rider plays like a combination of Zippy Race, Spy Hunter, and Outrun. I am not that sad sort of person, but Knight Rider really does play like that if we're being honest. You have a set amount of time in which to reach each checkpoint, and you need to avoid and destroy all the other cars on the road. As in Spy Hunter, the black Knight Industry trucks will provide you with power-ups, and you can tell which of the other cars on the road are dangerous thanks to their helpful color coding. It is a pretty repetitive game, admittedly, with each level presenting the same set of enemies along a steadily more challenging progression curve. And that curve is super hard from the outset. This is a race against time, like Outrun, but you also have to manage your shields and your gas. You need to take out opposing enemy drivers, especially the yellow cars that drop precious power-ups, including the all-important time boosters, and you lose time if you destroy neutral cars. And then there are the helicopters that can only be destroyed with your missiles, and the non-enemy cars that nevertheless swerve to block your path and destroy your momentum, and, well anyway, it's tough and repetitive. But since there's a password system, it's not like you have to play the entire thing all the way through. And for fans of the show, it just might be worth it for the opportunity to live out some of the show's most famous conflicts. Not just Kit versus Goliath, but also encounters with helicopters, and even the final boss, the deadly Car. That's K-A-R-R, thank you.
Well, it's peak NES times, and that means anything goes when it comes to licensing media properties to create games for children, including graphically violent and overly brutal socio-political satires of the rising fascism of the American corporate police state.
Hey, wait a second. Michael Knight was a policeman who was shot in the head and left for dead in the line of duty, only to be given a new name and face while driving around in a car with a cool Cylon eye plate. Now we have Alex Murphy, a policeman shot in the head and left for dead in the line of duty, only to be given a new name and face that has a cool Cylon faceplate. You know, come to think of it, I've never seen Robocop and Knight Rider in the same place at the same time before. There's no mistaking Robocop for Knight Rider, though. One is a critically panned, lightweight show for kids, and one is a brutally violent satire of the corporatization and dehumanization inherent in American capitalism. Now, you may find that hard to believe based on the sheer number of kid-oriented Robocop adaptations that existed in the world back in the late 80s and early 90s. From a prestige format Marvel comic to a toy line to a Saturday morning cartoon, Robocop integrated itself so intimately into tween pop culture that you might be absolutely shocked to discover that its origins were in a Paul Verhoeven movie that redefined the very limits of acceptable on-screen violence and gore that he was satirizing in the first place. Robocop tells the story of Murphy, a cop excruciatingly blown to pieces by a drug lord's gang, and then returned to a sort of cybernetic half-life by OCP, the private corporation that owns Detroit and manages its police force. There's a whole subplot about OPC's schemes to tear down old Detroit and replace it with a gleaming futuristic metropolis called Delta City, and half of OCP's C-suite appears to be in cahoots with the same crime cartels responsible for mostly murdering Murphy. There are no good guys in Robocop, except maybe the handful of beat cops who are doing their best to suppress crime in the face of stacked odds. Not only are their own bosses in on the drug racket, Murphy and his coworkers have to dress up in body armor for their daily routines because the cartels run around with military-grade weaponry in broad daylight. Murphy's transformation into Robocop is less an earnest corporate attempt to protect Detroit than it is a public relations program to showcase technology and put a cool but somehow reassuring face on their efforts to raise and rebuild the city into their own private Potemkin village. If the AI powering the company's Ed 209 mech hadn't been so unpredictably dangerous and unreliable, Murphy could have just pieced out instead of being resurrected into a shambling corpse powered by lies and baby food. As with a lot of Verhoeven's films, Robocop is a satire that lends itself to wild misreadings in the wrong direction, but it's hard not to see it as a frustratingly prophetic work today. Everything from the mandatory patrol cop body armor, to earnings-focused gentrification of an industrial and historically black city, to the horrifying failure of the Ed 209's AI test run, to the unchecked growth of automobile sizes, is 1987 peering ahead at 2026 and getting it right. That's great stuff for kids who definitely understood all that subtext. Especially all the scenes where bodies vaporize into geysers of chunky gore under a hail of machine gun fire, and veins are opened explosively and bloodily. Okay, but I'll admit it, Robocop does look super cool. And what kid wouldn't want to own a Robocop action figure, and maybe an Ed 209? Under no circumstances should they have watched the actual movie, but they could certainly enjoy the antiseptic ancillary media. And that movement really began here, with a video game. Well, technically, it began in 1988 when Ocean licensed the rights to the film for development into video games. They put together a bunch of computer games, then sub-licensed it all to Data East for arcades, NES, and Game Boy. We've already looked at the Game Boy version of Robocop, which technically came a year after the NES release, but never mind that. The Game Boy version does its best with the hardware, but really the most interesting thing about it is the fact that an entire generation of Europeans and Australians love Jonathan Dunn's soundtrack. Like, a lot. The NES version operates around more or less the same premise as the computer and arcade games, which is that Robocop walks left to right and shoots guys before taking on a boss at the end of each stage. But as so often was the case with the NES iterations of multi-platform releases, this adaptation, handled, like many Data East releases for NES by SAS Sakata, deviates from the other versions a fair amount. You'll spot the differences right away. Rather than beginning in downtown Detroit, this version kicks off at 2nd and Nash in something akin to an industrial area, with downtown in the distance. Rather than face Ed 209 at the end of Stage 1, you instead fight some oversized punk. In many other versions, the first stage ends with a first-person hostage minigame, but I wouldn't be surprised to learn that Nintendo really didn't like the idea of players gunning down a man who held a woman hostage with all the unsavory implications that carry over from that scene in the film. There are some first-person shooting sequences, mind you. These take the form of the precinct's target shooting range. Only the gentlest uses of deadly weapons for our Nintendo cyber hero. Things change even more dramatically once you reach the second stage and discover that progression in this Robocop involves more than simply walking left to right killing dogs and teenagers. A few stages require you to enter doors and navigate spaces, sometimes seeking out destructible walls in order to progress. Why, this isn't a one-way ratchet scrolling game. What kind of Robocop is this anyway? Well, like usual, this Robocop's default weapon is his metal fist of justice, though in many situations, I guess when he's not on the street near possible civilians or something, he can draw his service auto pistol and gun down baddies. You can also find limited use alternate weapons, a powerful submachine gun, and the incredibly destructive, but very limited Cobra rifle. This version gives you separate button inputs for punching and shooting, which allows you to punch walls while armed, but also means that this iteration of Robocop can't jump. So fundamentally, this game is a side-scrolling brawler-type action title in the vein of Altered Beast or Legendary Axe, but somehow it's even more limited. Still, I think these changes are mostly for the best. There was no way the NES could have recreated the arcade experience in a satisfactory way. The coin-op game was dumb and shallow, but it looked slick as hell, and attempting to recreate that on this console would have led to a game that was just dumb and shallow. See also most of the computer adaptations. This is not some comprehensive NES reinvention on the order of Rygar or Bionic Commando, but it does feel a little more substantial than other renditions of the game. And it looks pretty decent, featuring lots of angular mechanical details in the scenery of OCP headquarters, and delivering extremely stylized interpretations of story sequences that make heavy use of rim lighting on black to compensate for the lack of visual detail and storage space. All in all, it's a pretty okay effort, even if it feels incredibly unfair in places and expects an awful lot of memorization. Really though, the biggest knock against this release is that it comes just a few months after Data East's own NES rendition of the very similar Bad Dudes, which makes it feel a little redundant maybe? I guess the question is, would you rather save the president or fight corporate corruption as a cyber guy? I can certainly tell you which of those Paul Verhoeven would choose.
Next time on NES Works,